Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel where we will discuss how justice and equity are taken into consideration for public engagement training. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping points. As you've seen in other sessions, I'm sure, please make sure that you use the Q&A function to submit questions to the panel. We'll be able to do a little bit of Q&A towards the end of the discussion. And you can use the chat to share resources and have offline discussion in addition to what we're stating verbally. My name is Poston. I am the SciComm Trainers Network Weaver. This is a relatively new network that has an emphasis on diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion within SciComm training. And I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator. We are joined by three outstanding panelists who will share their expertise on some of the ways that they have been able to infuse justice and equity in their work. And so I'm really excited to be able to connect with them and hear from them today. I'm going to start with a specific question for all of the panelists, and I'll give you a brief introduction for each of the speakers as well. So we'll start with Alexandra Canet. She's a science communicator with a journalism background, and she's worked in the public engagement and artificial intelligence and computer vision space in Barcelona, and is now working on public engagement of genomics at the Wellcome Genome campus. So Alexandra, I'll give you the first opportunity to respond to our first question, which is, how are you infusing justice and equity in your public engagement work?
Thank you, Chloe. First of all, just to say I'm really happy here and sharing the room with amazing panelists, and really keen and looking forward to learning from all of you here today. So how have we been doing this at the Wellcome Genome campus? So we've been doing it in two ways. First of all, making sure that the training and the opportunities we are providing in public engagement are actually accessible to all our scientists on campus. And then secondly, by assessing our own power and privilege as a public engagement practitioners team. So on the first point, we have people from all walks of life on campus. We're 2,500 people with different roles, skills, backgrounds, ethnicities, faiths, and genders. But how do we make sure that they get to work with the public and thus provide different role models for the communities we're working with? You know, we want wet lab scientists with a hijab talking to children. We want female bioinformaticians with piercings and tattoos inspiring the next generation of female coders. We want senior managers with different accents and skin color talking about leadership. But how do we get there? This all starts with the training and the opportunities that we're laying out for them. But if they're not accessible, we're not going to get them all on board, and we'll get the usual suspects. So we've been working a lot on campus to remove those barriers and identify the tools needed by our campus staff so that we get everyone on board. How have we done this? So very importantly, the public engagement training and work that our scientists do, they do it during their working hours. It's part of their job. It's from 9 to 5. We don't expect them to do this outside of that time. Secondly, the work that they're doing in public engagement is recognized and supported by managers. Not all of them, but we are working towards for it to be the norm on site. We also recognize public engagement formally with public engagement prizes, monetary prizes, which are rewarding that work. And last but not least, we're creating spaces where these scientists can discuss with their peers these topics about diversity, inclusion, justice, and also one-to-ones in which they can talk to us openly about their fears, doubts, limitations, and thus we can elicit action and remove those barriers. So that's on the first aspect. And the second one is the power and privilege assessment that we're doing as a team. And this is something we're doing right now at the moment, and it have to difficult and frustrating experience, but it's really, really helpful because we are understanding and analyzing our own privilege as a public engagement team. We're a team of 10, mostly white, middle to upper class, educated, and also English is our first language. So there are certain privileges that we need to take into account and understand how they can be a barrier to connect not only with our own scientists, but also with the communities we want to work with. And with this, we're shifting the focus and acknowledging that our own privilege and genomics as a science historically has played a role, a role we need to understand how this has impacted different communities. And with this, we can then define and provide training and opportunities that really try to target inequity and allow us to understand the fundamental barriers that do not allow some of our scientists or some of the communities to interact with us. And well, I must say that this is the start of a long journey. We're on it, and we're very keen to learn and share more experiences with all of you here today. Thank you
for that overview. It's much appreciated, and I really like the idea of confronting your own privilege and thinking about the ways in which that impacts the work. I think that's really critical as folks embark on this journey. The next person that we'll hear from is Kate Carter. Kate has a PhD in human evolutionary biology from Harvard University and over 15 years of informal science education experience. She specializes in producing science outreach experiences that are community specific. Kate, I'll give you the floor. Tell us how you are infusing justice and equity in your public engagement.
Sure. So I work for an organization called the National Center for Science Education, and we're really focused on reaching people who are distrustful of science, particularly around potentially controversial issues. And when I took on this role, what I realized is that as I started training people in academia to work with communities across the country, is there really is no one size fits all answer for engaging communities. Because I've had to do it at scale, it's presented a lot of issues, but it's also given a lot of insights for what are some kind of broad takeaways that perhaps might be useful for all of you lovely attendees thinking about how to impart equity and inclusion in your work. One of the things that we found to be most useful is really using the user experience design framework. And I think it's a really good reminder that a lot of science outreach and a lot of engagement starts at step 3, where you have an idea and you want to go out into the community and implement the idea. But what we find is that that doesn't always work well. So it's really important to understand how your community ideates science, because as some of the speakers said yesterday, the way that we think about science is very different in different communities, and people's personal relationships and their emotions to it really impact the way that they're going to respond to outreach. And then also in trying to work within a embedded community network. I think another thing that I've learned is just how important it is, even though the approach is so different, to really go out and work within the network. So instead of just doing your own thing and coming in as an academic, to come in within the, within whatever services are already existing, within whatever outreach is already existing, and trying to add value in that way. Finally, I think when you're kind of doing the training for public engagement, because I'm working with graduate students and training them to kind of go out in the communities, when we train people about evaluation, it's really easy to be like, okay, and then you have to create an evaluation about your work. But if you don't start from the perspective of what do people in your community want to learn, what do people in your community find exciting, if you write that evaluation based on your understanding of science rather than the people that you're actually trying to reach as understanding of science, it's really hard to tell whether or not you've been successful. So those are some of the major ways in which we've tried to tweak kind of a traditional science engagement, science outreach program into one that's really focused on working in a variety of communities at a much more embedded level.
So much for sharing that experience. I think really thinking through ways in which you're thinking of justice and equity from ideation through to evaluation is incredibly important. So thank you for bringing that aspect. Next, we'll hear from Alberto Roca. Dr. Roca is Executive Director of the nonprofit DiverseScholar, whose mission is to diversify the doctoral STEM workforce, tech industry, and science communication professions. He created the web portal minoritypostdoc.org, has founded the postdoc committee of the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, or SACNAS, and co-founded the diversity committee of the National Postdoctoral Association. Alberto's has a great background in this work and is one of my colleagues. So Alberto, I'll welcome you to answer the question. How are you infusing justice and equity in your public engagement?
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation and the kind words. So my nonprofit works primarily in STEM diversity efforts here in the United States. So we're known more for the career portal Minority Postdoc, which acts as a vehicle for informing minority PhD trainees, graduate students, and postdocs how to advance in their career. Not specifically for an academic outcome, but that is one of our goals of faculty diversity. But we're more than just a job board. The nonprofit itself is called DiverseScholar, and that's the same brand we use for the original articles that we publish. And so that's where I became interested in science communication and science journalism workforce diversity. So we were publishing articles, but I was also curious about diversity in that space among the workforce. And so we got a grant from the National Association of Science Writers to catalyze a SciComm Diversity Fellowship. And so we're trying to help diversify the workforce in both science communication and science journalism through the activities of our fellowship. But so a lot of my experience I was able to bring together in a chapter that I wrote for a book called The Complete Guide to Science Blogging. The book is a little old, so it talks about blogging. But my particular chapter is on using social media to diversify science. And so that's just an example of how I don't necessarily do the training or training of scientists in public engagement or public engagement myself. Instead, I'm trying to bring together experts or my own expertise to educate people about STEM diversity or how we can diversify science journalism and science communication. And so I'm going to keep this a little short because I'm going to put in some links to that chapter. But then also the fellowship itself was described recently in a Frontiers in Communication paper. And so I'll put a link there. But so that summarizes about 5 years worth of activities that we did. And the fellowship was structured in a way that these minority journalists and scientists who participated in the program had reporting assignments where they wrote essays on their own thinking about science communication, science journalism diversity, or at the NASW conference, they would cover the conversations that were happening there. So we have like maybe 20 articles on DiverseScholar about those topics. And so I would encourage you to learn. So I'll keep it short and plug a bunch of other stuff throughout the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
So I'm going to pause from my list of questions to take one from the audience. And it is responding directly to one of the things that you mentioned, Alexandra, around like the history of genomics and a lot of basic science. So how does acknowledging and considering this history influence the words and the frameworks that we use to talk about these subject areas, both within our field and with colleagues and with members of the community?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was muted. This is a very good question, and this is precisely what we are investigating with this work. So as I said, we're in the middle of this work, and some of the things that have started to come up is mainly understanding the communities that have been impacted by genomics and why they might be hesitant to engage with the work that we are doing, because genomics, for example, can't be untangled of eugenics. And this is something we need to acknowledge and we need to understand. So it's mainly providing us the insight on why there might be audiences that we cannot reach if we don't start acknowledging this and start building trust from scratch. And then also things that have made us start thinking like different things that you see in popular science. There was a tweet by National Geographic I saw some weeks ago that was talking about how to discover talent in genetics, in our genes. So where is talent codified in our genes? We know that is not true, that you can't find talent in genes, but still in popular science, we're seeing these statements. And us as a team, we need to make sure we're challenging them and that we're not repeating them, that we're not trying to reach the public using those same mechanisms, but actually let's understand what has happened in the past to start building something, and let's go away from these statements that are quite dangerous.
I think that is really at the center of community engagement, especially when it comes to marginalized communities that have these really troubled histories with science. It's certainly a barrier that needs to be overcome before you can begin the conversation. So I'll jump to the next question. Of course, we know that this work is not easy. So what are some challenges to justice and equity and public engagement that you've encountered, and how have you addressed them?
I'm happy to go yep. Okay, so going back a bit to my initial thoughts, a challenge that I've always found is the fact that we always get them. So my role works with our scientists and supports them to do public engagement. And something that I always realized that is that we always got the usual suspects doing public engagement, mainly people who had the time to do it outside of their working hours, for example, because they had the privilege to like me today, be talking with you outside of my working hours, because where I'm at now, it's in the evening, but I have been able to pay childcare to look after my children, so I can be here speaking with you. So traditionally, it's people with more privileges who have engaged with public engagement. So my challenge has always been, how can we reflect the diversity we have in academia in the public engagement activities? How can we do that? And what I have found is that it's really important to understand their needs, to listen, to go to the different committees where we find the PhDs or postdocs, understand what are the barriers, what are not enabling them to engage with us, and really make an effort to change the structures that we have in place so that they can come and they can start engaging. And in this way, we're diversifying the role models that are going out there and talking with communities. So for me, this has been a challenge, and I still don't have the solution completely, and I'd love to hear from others in the room.
Thank you. Alberto or Kate, do you have thoughts on this? Alberto, go ahead.
So one frustrating challenge I see more in the media space, I don't know as much about sort of museums or things like that, but in media, I definitely find a problem of the blind spots or erasure of certain peoples. And partly this is because the workforce in journalism in particular is so white and male. And so that then certain voices, certain stories, or so on are not seen. And so then I try to work then on trying to diversify the workforce. So that would include either training minority scientists, broadly defined, because it depends upon your discipline. One of our slogans in the nonprofit is, "We're all minorities, let's help each other." You know, there's a lack of women in, let's say, computer science versus many women in biological sciences and in the pipeline, but not as many in leadership positions. So it really depends upon the context. But basically, trying to increase the number of minority scientists who know how to do science communication, science engagement, but then also advocacy to try to get the stakeholders to understand in media and whoever, also the gatekeepers, that these issues are important and that these are the people who hopefully stories can be told, either from a scientist's own perspective or them advocating for some type of story or issue that is affecting their own community in the public. But so the advocacy type work I'm trying to do lately has been through the conference that we put together. So the minority postdocs and graduate students that I bring together at the DiverseScholar postdoctoral conference is more of a professional development, training, mentoring, and recruiting event, but I tried to put in diversity conversations, particularly with the science communication focus. And I happened to notice that one of the attendees of our session today is one of our past plenary speakers, Dr. Dion Rossiter, who gave a talk more on the practical advice and lessons that the graduate students and postdocs need to use science communication skills in their career. But then for this year, our two plenaries, which I'll put in the chat, are focusing on this erasure topic in particular. For my own needs and interests, being a Latino, a Peruvian American, I don't see many Latinos in social media or in news stories. And so we have an expert whose PhD actually is in science communication. This is Lisette Torres, who will be talking about her scholarship. Her PhD thesis was on interviewing scientists of color, mostly women, who do science blogging. And so she'll talk about the lessons she's learned there. But being a Latina, being disabled, I hope she will also discuss issues about being Latinx in STEM online, because that is one way to engage the public now, since traditional media channels, even broadcasts, don't necessarily reach everyone since we're in so much of our silos, but social media can sometimes spread further. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a new channel. TikTok, for example, can go viral and cross over into multiple media channels. But then the other plenary speaker that I'm really excited about is Danielle Lee, who is sort of a pioneer in using outreach methods online to educate the public about science. She's faculty who is an expert on rats and urban ecology, but she'll be talking about hashtag Black in STEM, sort of as one of the first efforts to try to unify online the Black and African American community here, at least in the United States, but has gone global. She'll be talking about sort of the history and the future of this movement, which in the last year, especially because of Black Lives Matter, exploded. And so we have maybe about 20 to 40 different Black in STEM grassroots movements that are very discipline specific. There's Black in microbiology, Black in neuroscience. There's even one for Black in psychom that Dr. Poston has been involved with. And so there's a number of grassroots efforts bringing together these people from different disciplines who are celebrating themselves and definitely having a support system, but then because it's online and in the public, works as a venue for then educating the general public about their issues and their needs, and hopefully then eliminating this erasure issue. So those are the few things that I'll respond to here.
Thank you. Kate.
Sure. Well, thank you both, Alberto and Alexandra. Those were a lot to think about, and I'm definitely jotting down notes. I think for the work that I do, one of the things that has come up, and this is perhaps obvious, but it's hard to work in areas where it's hard. And I find a lot of the time I do training that people are shocked when the systemic barriers that have made it difficult for certain groups to access science also impact their ability to do outreach. So I think when we're training the next generation of scientists to do effective public engagement, we need to support them as they become embedded in different communities and help them really develop the skills to do it well. Because it's, when you have scientists who are so excited about sharing themselves and so excited about sharing the science, but then they realize that a lot of the work of public engagement is not about the science. It's about the relationship building. It's about understanding the communities. And it's really important when you're doing the training to make sure that they have those skills too. And I think a lot of times what I've heard from scientists who are interested in public engagement is that they really get intimidated and are scared of having to learn those skills. So really having ways where they can gain those skills easily, I think has been a problem that we've encountered and something that we've been, again, trying to work on. iteratively.
Thanks, Kate. That raises a really great point. I'm working in conversation with a series of science museums, and one of the things that we've been talking about as we look to interact and engage more diverse communities is how we can make the value of the museum salient to the needs of the community, and hearing from and centering those needs, as opposed to just reaching out and making assumptions about what people need and want and value, and instead actually embedding that into the strategy and the ways in which organizations are doing business. So really appreciate that point.
I'd like to follow up. Some of the context, I believe, is that if a mostly majority white male, or even frankly white female, white cis female workforce, the scientists in industry, the scientists in academia, may not have much experience with the minority community, then how can they learn? How can they build a relationship? At a national level, what I try to do is provide information on my website, and then through sort of the various talks and articles that I'm promoting here about what I call diversity stakeholders. And so on the website, the stakeholders page lists the different national organizations that work in this area. Many of them I've already mentioned, that are these new, what I call grassroots movements. Black in Neuro, Black in Micro, for example, started as just a hashtag. They've now are filing for official 501c3 nonprofit status here in the United States. Well, the exact same thing happened 40 and 50 years ago. The civil rights movement here in the United States definitely was the early Black Lives Matter movement. Not only was it happening in the streets, it was also happening in academia. And so minority scientists were coming together and forming their own organizations. And so you had the formation of, for example, the Black Psychologists Association, Black Sociologists Association, National Organization for Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers, and then for my own community, SACNAS, as was mentioned in my introduction, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. Today, that would be just known as Latinx in STEM. So you have these historical pioneer organizations that for the last 40 plus years have been working, as well as then these newer grassroots movements. So my call to action then is that if you don't know about a community that is underrepresented for either some cultural designation or for your own specific field, find one of these diversity stakeholder organizations and engage, but do so respectfully. So just attend and listen, volunteer, but basically that is their platform. And so you instead are trying to build relationships with someone who could be your liaison to the community for your own efforts when you go back and return to your home institution or your museum or so on. And then specifically for communication and media, if you're trying to do stories and don't want to just still quote the same old, male, pale, stale source, here you can also find other sources for experts. And so that's what I'm trying to do through the diversity stakeholders page, is try to bring together these different opportunities for people to engage. And then when I can, provide a venue for them to promote themselves. And especially these newer grassroots movements, since they don't have as much visibility, I've really focused on them. And so at the Science Talk conference that happened in the spring, I brought together a Black in STEM panel for Black in Mental Health, Black in Psychom, and a Black in Neuro. And so we're going to have a short article about that panel published soon. And then the plenary talks that I've already plugged in the chat are going to be something similar. And I'm hoping that a proposal will be accepted for the upcoming SACNAS conference in the fall, which will focus on the Latinx and STEM community. And so that way, hopefully, the majority of the workforce in STEM will know who to engage with and understand sort of our issues.
Thank you. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function. And I'm going to move on to our next question. I'm going to ask the panelists to be a little visionary and forward-looking and think about how public engagement in general is evolving over time, and also what the role of justice and equity will continue to be going forward, especially as we're in this moment where there's been renewed emphasis on social justice and racial equity. I'm wondering if you see this continuing on. Is it simply a trend for now? And what potential change could it have in the field? I'm going to call on Kate to go first.
I was about to unmute myself, so good thinking. The first thing is I really want to add a +1 to what Alberto said. Like, that was it. That kind of work, engaging with stakeholders, it's A, really important, and B, it's not optional. If you really want to have an impact, it's not the icing on the cake. It is the foundational work you need to do before becoming embedded in a community. So I did not know that that resource is available, and I'll definitely be checking it out. One of the really exciting things that I've seen is, 10 years ago, the conversation was all about, well, how can we, reach these communities? Every public engagement was really focused on reaching two diverse communities. I will make a note, everybody can Google, and one of the consistent problems I've seen is that the most diverse area, or the most diverse school, or the school with the most free lunches, those tend to actually be overserved by outreach right now. But the second most, it tends to be completely overlooked because everybody Googles the same thing. So if you take away one practical thing, do a little bit more deeper dive before engaging with the community. But we've started really trying to do the hard work of, instead of doing outreach and public engagement to diverse groups, to do it with diverse groups. And that kind of shift in mindset is something that I think that we're still trying to figure out exactly what it means and grapple with exactly what we as scientists need to do to kind of support the work, understand where our own identity is shaping. One really interesting conversation that I've been a part of is when we are, we had a question about framing and words earlier. And one of the things that I think is really important is when we as academics try and, use our power to amplify voices, how do we do that in a way that is not extractive and is not using other people's words to tell our own stories? And that's certainly something that in my own, growth and progress has been something that I've been trying to work with. But I think, stepping back a little bit, that's a really different conversation from what we were having 10 years ago. It's a lot more nuanced, and it feels like it's going into a lot better place. So I think I feel cautiously optimistic about how things are going on.
I agree completely.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Chloe. I agree completely with Kate in so many points. I love, and with Alberto, with the diversity stakeholders, I wrote that down and highlighted it because I think it's an amazing initiative. But what Kate was saying about shifting the focus and saying, it's not about us, the communities coming to us, but what matters to them and how can we make the effort? Who has the motivation? We have the motivation. We have the resources. So we're the ones who have to make an effort, but not to go out to them and just tell them what we want to tell them. But if we want to have a conversation, do we really know what they're fighting for, what they need? So I think, Kate, you were spot on there. And I do think, and I'm also very optimistic that we're shifting the focus and we're going towards this and actually building those bridges with community partners to try and understand how our work can impact them, but truly impact them, not just let's go and tell them and fill a void, of education, of learning, but really what is mattering, what matters to them and how can we help them? A very, an example would be, when researchers, they want to go and tell them their latest breakthrough because that is their motivation to talk with the public. But what is this? How does this impact a mother of 3 children who cannot pay her rent? What change is it? How is this affecting her life? However, if we sat down and we had the time and the resources to listen to that mother, maybe she would tell us that she's, worried about the future of her children. And then the focus of the scientist could actually be, well, I can give your children some tips and advice of local places where they can go and start experimenting with science and what a science career looks like, and how the different steps. So it's really creating an impact. And going back to diversifying the role models, that's something I think it's really important. Who, this mother and this children, who are they going to listen to? Are they envisioning a world they think they can fit into, or are they not? So that's why diversifying the voices that are doing public engagement is so vital for me.
Alberto, excuse me, did you want to jump in on this one as well?
I'll try to be a little provocative here, specifically on what I see are some of the challenges of these efforts with respect to the work that diversity stakeholders are going. Here in STEM, those that I mentioned, this is very similar to the larger sort of civil rights movement, specifically for basically resources. Resources and power are limiting. And so when those are limiting, then these movements can not advance, either because there's burnout from the leadership or just because there isn't a way to sustain themselves. So what is necessary for the larger civil rights movement is also necessary for sort of diversity stakeholders in STEM. And what I'll say specifically is for the Native American and American Indian community, treaties must be honored. For the Black and African American community, reparations must be paid. These are the resources and the power that will allow these movements to flourish. Otherwise, white supremacy, unfortunately, will hold us down. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. A very valid point also. I think many science communication communities especially have been grappling with ways to name and address white supremacy culture, both in the world and within their own organizations. I think it's a valid point. So I appreciate you bringing that up. We've got about 8 minutes left, and I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to hear about additional resources that you may not have already shared in the chat. So are there specific resources you'd recommend for someone new to public engagement in science who's looking to do this work well and maybe very green, in addition to those that are in the chat?
I'll just plug two more organizations and activities that are specific to science engagement, more from either science journalism, science communication, or science policy aspect. And that is Inclusive SciComm, coming out of the work of Sunshine Menendez. Professor Menendez is at the University of Rhode Island. So that conference is coming up. It's going to be online also, so please look up inclusivescicomm.org. And then more of a grassroots movement started by graduate students, but just as effective. If you look up the Twitter account reclaiming_STEM, that is a science communication and science policy workshop for graduate students by graduate students. And some of their stuff is online too. But so I would encourage you to look up the work of those efforts.
Thank you. Kate, do you have any resources you would share? I think you're muted, Kate.
Most of them are already on this very long list that I'm looking at in the chat. I will add that one of the ones that has been really helpful at an organizational level and kind of with the groups that we work with is Of, By, For, All. So it's not specific to, it's really designed for nonprofits and museums, but it's really about thinking about ways from the top down you can change the way that your organization engages. And so it's been really helpful if you're doing the really difficult work of unpacking some of your systemic biases or some of your organization's biases and thinking about ways to really meaningfully grow past that, not just, slap a diversity statement on your website. That has been really helpful for us. So I can put the link down there.
Thank you for sharing that link. I think it's really important that we think about how we can both think about individual and organizational change at the end. Oftentimes that has to happen simultaneously. So being really thoughtful about our strategy is critical. So appreciate that resource. Alexandra.
There are some amazing resources already in the chat. I just shared one that is the Staying In, which is a charity run by disabled people in the UK. And they explain how to prepare events and training that cater for all the different needs. And it's really, really interesting. And really, more than a resource, an advice that I would give to someone who wants to start doing public engagement or is already doing public engagement is to research a little bit the history of the science topic they're working on. Understand how it has impacted different communities historically. And I think that will give that person a perspective of where that science stands in society and will give them a bit of insight on how to tackle better the issues and also not continue making the damage, if that makes sense. So that is something that for us as a team is being incredibly useful. And it would be an advice that I would give anyone who wants to continue doing public engagement.
So, I will ask the last question from the audience, and it is, how do you define basic science in your trainings, and how the values basic science holds vary in different communities that you interact with? Anyone want to take that one?
I'll start, and then I will let other people chime in. So I'm going to start with the second part of that question, which is this idea that, you want to understand how a community that you're working with thinks about science and values science, but how do you do that in a way that doesn't feel extractive? Because you don't want to just go and talk to a lot of people and publish a paper using their words and without having it be something that is mutually beneficial. And I will be honest, this is hard. This is really hard to do. And I'm not saying that I have done it 100% successfully. But I think you need to kind of work on a way of instead of it being you're doing a research project or you're doing the foundational understanding for, launching a public engagement project, that you, with your resources that you are going to share, and that isn't just your knowledge of science, but it may be that you have monetary resources, or if you're involved in an organization that has power in the community in some way, that you are there to bring your resources to the table. So to kind of have an open discussion, try and understand, but not just walk away from that community after you get that information and how you understand how that community values basic science, but to have it be the beginning of a discussion. So I'll stop there. Alexandra, Alberto, do you want to chime in?
And I will challenge you to respond in 30 seconds because our time is short.
I will give a sort of maybe a larger perspective. And the problem is that there are gatekeepers who decide what is legitimate work or not. And this can be a really serious problem. Look at what's happened at University of North Carolina, where the board has actually decided what is legitimate scholarship when they tried to squelch Professor Nicole Hannah-Jones's work. And so this is a huge problem when it's not just sort of like what we're doing in our own research environments or our own outreach efforts, but the institution itself can be structured in a way that can squelch what is basic science or legitimate work or something that you want to do. We need leadership change. We need to educate the leadership.
I'm feeling the pressure of the time. So very much in line with what Kate and Alberto have said. It's really, for us with the communities we work with, genomics is a basic science, but it has so many applications and has had, so many different theories that have impacted in different ways that at the moment, what we're trying to do is to build those bridges with the communities to understand what does genomic mean for them, because we have very different communities we want to work with, but what does it mean for them? So first we need to listen, understand what this means to them, and then we can start building that relationship. And that's a bit at the point we're at now.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much. Thank you to my panelists, Alexandra, Alberto, and Kate. I really appreciate all of your insights. And thank you to the audience for joining and sharing so many resources in the chat. I encourage folks to take a look at that. It's a really robust list. And I hope you all are able to visit some of the community lounges and other features of the conference. I look forward to seeing you in other sessions, and have a great rest of your day.